The village apothecary's back room smelled of dried herbs and beeswax, and the light through its single window was the gray gold of a late October afternoon. Miss Ottilie Brixham set a small glass vial on the wooden counter with a steadiness she'd been practicing since she found it, and she watched Mr. Pettigrew's face as he picked it up. He was 61 years old and had been mixing compounds in this room for 35 of them, and he did not rush. He unstoppered the vial, held it beneath his nose, then touched a single drop to the tip of his tongue. He spat into the basin at his elbow. He waited. He touched another drop to his tongue and spat again. And when he looked up at her, his expression had changed in a way that tightened something in her throat. Outside on the village lane, a cart rattled past. Someone called a greeting. The ordinary world continued. And inside this small room, a man who had never in 3 years of her custom shown her anything but professional courtesy was looking at her as though he was deciding how much to say. "Miss Brixham," he said. She met his gaze. "Yes." "Where did you find this?" "In the inside pocket of the young master's riding coat. The label says tonic." "I do not believe the label." Mr. Pettigrew set the vial down on the counter between them. He did not step back from it, but she noticed he did not touch it again. "You are correct not to believe the label," he said. "This is laudanum, Miss Brixham, concentrated heavily, more heavily than anything I would sell over this counter, and I would not sell this concentration at all. I would use 1/3 of this strength for a grown man in severe pain. For a child of 9, a single dose of this would lay him out for 12 hours. A dose a week for a month would leave him too ill to ride, too dull to learn, and eventually too weak to fight a common fever." Ottilie heard every word. She kept her hands flat on the counter and said, "Who would have access to a preparation of this strength?" "A physician, a hospital apothecary, or someone who knew what they were asking for and found a supplier who did not ask questions." He paused. "Who gave it to him?" "I do not yet know. Miss Brixham." He said her name a second time, differently, not the professional address of a man conducting a transaction, but the measured care of someone who understood what she was standing inside. "Do you know what you are telling me?" "I know exactly what I am telling you, Mr. Pettigrew," she said. "I am asking you to write it down, in your own hand, signed and dated. I will need it by this evening." He looked at her for a moment. Taking in, she thought, the gray palais, the 3 years of her face in this village, the fact that she had come alone and had not trembled. And then he moved to the small writing desk at the back of the room and sat down without another word. "I will have it in an hour," he said. He dipped his pen. Then he stopped and turned once more. "Miss Brixham." She waited. "Yes." "Whoever placed that vial in a child's coat is going to try again. Act as though tomorrow is already too late." She walked back to Ravenholme Court through the October woods, with the vial wrapped in her handkerchief, and Mr. Pettigrew's statement folded in her pocket. The trees had turned, and some had shed entirely, and the path was deep in leaves that made no sound under her boots because the afternoon had been damp. She had 3 years to think about on that walk. 3 years of reports made in good faith, in writing and in person, and 6 polite, firm, entirely unmoved dismissals from the Duke of Ravenholme, who had always listened to her with his full attention and then done precisely nothing. A loose girth on Hugo's saddle in September, and the stable boy dismissed at Sir Denholm Calverston's quiet request 2 days later. A fall that might have been a broken neck and was instead a bruised shoulder, and a boy who had not asked to ride again since. She turned the vial in her handkerchief as she walked and arrived at the Duke's study at 6 o'clock in the evening. Lord Oriel Calverston was at his desk when she entered. He was 39 years old, and had the particular stillness of a man who managed a great deal by never appearing to move quickly. And he rose when she came in, which he always did, a courtesy that had always seemed to her entirely insufficient to the circumstances. She placed the vial on his desk. She placed Mr. Pettigrew's statement beside it. "I found this in the inside pocket of Hugo's riding coat this morning," she said. "Mr. Pettigrew has confirmed it is concentrated laudanum. His statement describes the likely physiological effect on a child of 9. I would ask you to read it, Your Grace." Oriel picked up the statement. Their fingers met on the paper as he took it. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. His hand not releasing it immediately, her hand not withdrawing. And then the paper passed entirely to him, and she stepped back. He read it. She watched him read it. And she watched him read it again, and then he set it on the desk and was quiet for a moment with his hand flat beside it. "Miss Brixham," he said, "I hear you. I am taking this seriously." Then, "I am asking you," he said, and something in his voice stopped her. Not the authority of an employer, which she had heard before, but something that cost him more than authority. "To leave this with me tonight. Say nothing to anyone, including the Dowager. Come to me at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I ask this of you as your employer and as Hugo's father. Please." She looked at his face. What she saw there was not the smooth, professional composure of the 5 previous dismissals. There was strain in it, in the set of his jaw, in the way his hand remained flat on the desk rather than gesturing, in the particular quality of his stillness, which was not ease but effort. She registered it. She did not yet have the vocabulary for what the strain meant, because 3 years of being told she was imagining things had produced one reading of this kind of scene. And this looked to her, in the only language available to her, like the 6th version of it. Strain was what a man's face showed when he did not want to act and was being asked to justify the inaction. "I will not be here at 8, Your Grace," she said. She left the study. She did not take the back stairs. She walked the long way around the east wing, through the garden passage, and down the lane to the Dower House. And she knocked. Lady Gwyneth Calverston opened the door. She was 66, and she had the kind of face that had been beautiful at 30, and was now something more useful. A face that had made decisions and lived inside them. She looked at Ottilie's expression. Then she looked at the shape of the packet in the pocket of Ottilie's coat. She stood aside and held the door open. "Come in, Miss Brixham," the Dowager said. "I have been expecting you for some weeks." The Dower House table was small, and the candles burned down to stubs before the 2 women were finished. They worked methodically, where to go, what to take, which roads Ravenholme's hired men would watch if word reached him before morning. The Dowager knew the Cumberland roads because she had grown up on them, and she knew which coaching inns would ask questions and which would not, and she knew how to time a departure so that the house staff would not be asked to lie, only to have been asleep. Ottilie knew the children. Which one would wake easily and be frightened? Which one would ask questions and need answers? Which one would simply put on her coat and wait to understand later? Hugo was the one Ottilie thought about most, in the spaces between planning. He had been quieter for a month, not unhappy, not feverish. Quieter in the particular way of a child who has learned that drawing attention to himself produces unpleasant results. He had stopped asking to go to the stables. He had stopped finishing his meals and not mentioned it. These were the things Ottilie had written down in her reports and been told were the ordinary variations of a growing boy. At 4 in the morning, with the house still dark and the lane empty, Lady Gwyneth's carriage moved quietly out of the dower house yard. All 3 children were inside. Philippa in the corner with her eyes open and her mouth shut, which was her way. Hugo pressed against Ottilie's side with his coat buttoned wrong. Millicent asleep across the dowager's lap before the wheels had turned twice. The dowager herself was on the box, the reins in her gloved hands, her back very straight against the pre-dawn cold. Inside the main house, in his study, Lord Oriel Calverston had not slept. He was at his desk composing a letter to his London solicitor, Mr. Sebastian Whitford, requesting that the private investigation, which had been running for 8 months and was 3 weeks from completion, be accelerated to 72 hours. He heard the carriage on the drive. He heard it in the way a man hears a sound that he already knows the meaning of, and he dropped the letter and ran. He reached the front steps in time to see the gates swinging closed, in time to see, through the gap before the iron met iron, the shape of his mother's silhouette on the box, her shoulders, the set of her head, the particular angle of her arms holding the reins, disappearing into the dark of the lane beyond. He stood on the drive in his shirt sleeves until the sound of the wheels was entirely gone, and the October cold was considerable, and he did not move. He went back to his study, on the mantelpiece, placed where he would find it, and not where a servant would, was a folded letter in his mother's hand. He opened it. "I have done what you would not. The children are safe. Do not follow until you have what you need." He stood with the letter a moment. Then he put it in his coat pocket, sat down, and burned the original letter to Whitford in the grate. He wrote a new one. The language was different from anything he had written in 8 months of careful, measured correspondence, direct, stripped of legal qualification, specific about the consequence of delay. 72 hours, Whitford or Denholm reaches Scotland, and the ground collapses under all of it. I need the ledgers, the Starling correspondence, and the Laverley letter. Send Holthwaite north when you have them. He rode for London before 8 that morning. In the same days, Sir Denholm Calverston received word through a contact in the city that his November letter to a Mrs. Laverley, a letter detailing an arrangement he had expected the governess at Ravenholme to administer on his behalf, had been opened in London. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who calculated, and he calculated quickly. He paid his 3 most pressing debts in coin, told his household he was traveling north on family business, and departed before noon. He did not know which road the Duke had taken. The Duke did not know which road he had taken. They were moving now, toward the same point from opposite ends of the country, and neither knew it. The Cumberland cottage was small and cold and adequate, and the dowager managed it with the authority of a woman who had never in her life been managed by circumstance. She found the wood supply on the first morning and had Ottilie build the fire while she organized the kitchen. And by midday, on the first day, the children had eaten hot food and been told, in terms suited to each of them, that they were on an unexpected visit and that their father knew where they were. This was not precisely true, but the dowager had a long history of making statements that were true in the direction they needed to be true, and she did not apologize for it. Philippa, who was 11 and had her father's stillness without his warmth, asked on the second day whether they were in danger. Ottilie told her they had been in some danger at Ravenholme and were not in danger here, and Philippa accepted this and went back to the book she had thought to bring, which Ottilie noted and filed away as a thing to admire later. Hugo asked nothing. This was its own answer. He sat near Ottilie when she was in the room, and moved when she moved, and ate what was put in front of him. And on the third day, when she asked him if he would like to go outside and look at the beck, he looked up at her with an expression that she could not fully read and said, "If you come." She came. They stood at the edge of the water for half an hour and said very little. And when they went back inside, he sat down at the kitchen table and ate an entire bowl of porridge without being asked. And the dowager caught Ottilie's eye across the room and said nothing. On the 5th day, Millicent asked when Papa was coming. Ottilie said, "Soon, I think," and then went to the scullery on the pretext of fetching water, and stood at the stone sink with both hands on its edge and cried. Briefly, thoroughly, and in complete silence, because the scullery was at the back of the cottage and the water running from the pump covered what little sound she made. She had not cried since the apothecary's back room, when she had walked home through the woods alone with the knowledge of what was in that vial. And she had not cried then either. She had 5 minutes in the scullery, and then she washed her face in the cold water and went back to the kitchen. By the 6th day, the children had settled into a routine, and in the silence of the evenings, with the dowager knitting by the fire and the cottage dark beyond the windows, Ottilie began to fear she had miscalculated. She had taken 3 children from their father's house on the word of an apothecary, and 6 months of accumulating suspicion. And she had done it without his knowledge or consent. And she was a governess, a rector's daughter, self-supporting since 19, with no legal standing and no family connections that would protect her if a duke decided to prosecute. She sat with this fear and did not speak it, because speaking it in front of the dowager would require the dowager to reassure her, and she was not prepared to need that. In Ravenholme village, Sir Denholm Calverston was performing. He had arrived 2 days after the flight, wearing his most concerned expression, and had offered his resources to help locate the children. He had spoken of his grief for his cousin's distress. He had laid careful groundwork with 2 witnesses for the argument that the governess had acted without sanction and in a state of irrational alarm, and that the dowager, elderly and susceptible to suggestion, had been led astray by a woman in her employ. He was very good at this. He had been doing it for years. Mr. Abner Holthwaite arrived at the cottage on the evening of the 6th day. He was 57, the Ravenholme steward, and he had ridden hard enough that his horse needed attention before he did. And he saw to the horse first, which told Ottilie something about him that she had not previously had occasion to learn. He carried a sealed packet from the Duke, and he placed it on the kitchen table, and then went to sit by the fire with the cup of tea the dowager gave him, and did not explain its contents, because that was not his place. Ottilie broke the seal. 8 months of correspondence between the Duke and Mr. Sebastian Whitford in London. Careful, methodical letters building a case piece by piece. Each one dated, each one referencing evidence obtained through a Bow Street informant named in the margins. Copies of Denholm Calverston's debt ledgers, annotated in Whitford's hand, showing the scale of what he owed and to whom. A statement from the informant regarding Mrs. Laverley and the nature of the arrangement Denholm had sought to establish. And at the bottom of the packet, folded separately and sealed with a different wax, a letter in a hand Ottilie did not recognize, written on paper that had been handled many times. The ink faded in places, and the letters uneven in the way of a hand that had once been steady and was no longer. She read the salutation. "My dearest Oriel." She read it through to the end without stopping. Lady Isolde Calverston, in the last days of her life, 6 years ago, had seen her cousin by marriage with complete clarity. She had named what she feared. She had asked her husband to protect her children, And then she had asked him to do it quietly, without public trial, without the destruction of the name that her daughters would one day need to marry on. She had asked him to carry an impossible instruction, and had known, writing it, that it was impossible, and had asked it anyway, because she was dying, and it was all she had to give them. Ottilie sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she finished reading. The dowager read Isolde's letters separately, standing at the window with her back to the room. When she turned around, her face was composed, but she did not speak for several minutes, and she set the letter down on the table with the particular care of someone returning an object that does not belong to them. Ottilie looked at the 8 months of correspondence. She looked at the debt ledgers. She looked at the informant's statement about Mrs. Laverley and the arrangement regarding Hugo's governess. She thought about 6 dismissals. She thought about the strain she had seen in Oriel's face in the study on the night she brought him the vial, the strain she had not had the vocabulary for. And she sat with the reorganization of 3 years until it had settled into something she could see clearly. She had been right to act. He had not been wrong to try the other way. The collision of their 2 incompatible methods had saved the children, and she did not yet know what to do with that, except to continue. She took a sheet of paper from the writing case in the cottage's small parlor. She wrote 6 words. "Come, bring what you have. We have what you need." She folded it, sealed it, and gave it to Holthwaite, who finished his tea, saw to his horse a second time, and rode back into the dark. Oriel rode up to the cottage at 9 the next morning and did not dismount at the gate. He sat on his horse in the lane and waited, and Ottilie, who had heard the hooves on the track, opened the door. He looked as though he had not slept in 2 days, which was accurate. His coat was road-dusty and his jaw unshaved, and he was holding himself with the particular uprightness of a man running on determination rather than rest. He looked at her in the doorway and did not speak first. "Your Grace," she said, "Miss Brixham." He swung down from the horse and tied it at the gatepost. He did not come through the gate. "I understand you have read the packet." "All of it. I am not here to take the children. I am here because my timeline has collapsed, and I need your evidence combined with mine before Denholm crosses into Scotland. I have perhaps 72 hours before he is beyond reach of a Cumberland warrant. May I come in?" She stood in the doorway and did not move for 10 full seconds. Long enough that he registered it. Long enough that she intended him to. The kitchen door behind her was open, and she knew the dowager could hear every word. "You may come in," she said. "But first I want you to hear what I am going to say, with the door open as it is. You were right to keep Isolde's promise as long as it was keeping Hugo safe. I have read her letter, and I understand why you made the choices you made, and I would not ask you to have made them differently. But you were wrong. Not in method, Your Grace, in trust. Not to tell me, after the night I brought you that vial, that I had walked into the middle of something I could not navigate blind. I have spent 3 years in this position, believing that the man responsible for these children's safety could not see what was happening to them. I know now that you could see it. That is a different thing from blindness, and it is worse in some ways, even though I understand why it was necessary." She paused. "I will work with you now, because Hugo's safety requires it. We will discuss the rest when the children are safe. Come in." He stepped through the gate. As he passed her in the doorway, his hand brushed her sleeve. Deliberate, unhurried, a touch that acknowledged she was the one who had opened the door, and that he knew it. She did not withdraw. From the kitchen, the dowager said, "Tea. Both of you. Sit down. Holthwaite needs to ride to the village by early afternoon if we are to have the magistrate today." They sat down. They worked for 4 hours at the kitchen table, and it was not comfortable work. It was the work of two people who had been pursuing the same end from opposite ends of a house for 8 months, and were now, for the first time, looking at the same evidence in the same room. Auriel laid out the timeline of his investigation with the same precision he had been applying to it for months. And Ottilie laid out the 6 incidents she had documented, and the apothecary's statement, and the particular significance of the vial's placement in a coat pocket that Sir Denholm had handled during his last visit. They cross-referenced. They argued about the jurisdictional question, whether Cumberland or London. And Auriel conceded to her reasoning on the grounds that Cumberland was cleaner, the paperwork fewer, and the magistrate known to Holthwaite personally. They mapped Denholm's likely route from Carlisle, where the informant had last tracked him 2 days ago. They drafted the specific language for the warrant. At one point, Auriel said, "I could not tell you and leave you in the house, Miss Brixham. Any one of Denholm's visits might have required you to behave as though you suspected nothing. I was asking you to be evidence, and I could not afford for you to know you were being asked." Ottilie looked up from the ledger she was annotating. "I know that now," she said. "I am telling you that knowing it does not make the 3 years easier to account for. I am not asking you to justify it further. I am telling you that when this is finished, I expect to be told the things that affect how I protect this household. That is the only condition I am placing on this arrangement going forward." He met her eyes across the table. "Agreed," he said, and returned to the warrant language. By the time the sun had moved across the cottage windows, Holthwaite had been sent to the village with everything needed. The Cumberland magistrate was known to be a practical man. The warrant would be drafted by morning. That evening, the children were in bed early, worn through by a week of disrupted routine and the particular exhaustion of children who've been brave for longer than they should have had to be. Ottilie came downstairs after Millicent was settled and found the kitchen empty except for Auriel, standing at the table with both hands braced on its surface, not moving. He had been there for some time, she thought. The candle on the shelf had burned down considerably. He was looking at nothing, at the grain of the wood, perhaps, or at the inside of his own head, and he did not hear her on the stairs. She crossed the kitchen to him. He turned when she was close, and she put both arms around him. Fully, without hesitation, her face against the lapel of his coat, and held on. He held her back. Neither of them spoke. They stood like that in the quiet cottage kitchen while the candle threw its small light against the walls. And it was not a romantic gesture, and it was not a declaration. It was two people who had spent a week expecting to lose something irreplaceable, and had not lost it, and who needed, for a few minutes, to stand in the same place and know it together. When she pulled back, her hands rested briefly on his upper arms. She registered the solidity of him, the steadiness. And then she let go and stepped away, and neither of them remarked on it. At 6:15 the next morning, Ottilie was in the kitchen boiling water. The dowager was upstairs. Auriel had ridden out at 5 to meet Holthwaite and the Cumberland magistrate at the village inn 4 miles off, where the warrant was to be signed. The cottage was quiet. The fire was doing its work. She was thinking about nothing in particular. About the bread she would cut for the children's breakfast, about whether Hugo would eat this morning, when she heard hoofbeats on the track. Not from the direction of the village. She set down the kettle. She walked to the front window and looked out through the gray morning light. One rider. A gray horse. A dark coat, she knew. She had seen it arrive at Ravenholme 8 times in 3 years. always with that same easy seat, that same slight, forward lean of a man who rode as though he expected the ground to accommodate him. Sir Denholm Calverston dismounted at the gate. Ottilie crossed to the kitchen table. She took the long knife from the block, the bread knife, the one she had used every morning of the past week, and she carried it with her to the foot of the stairs. She looked up and drew a breath. Gwyneth. Level voice. 2 sentences, clearly spaced. He is here. The pistol. Keep the children in the room with the door locked. Do not come down unless I call. Above her, the sound of the dowager rising, the sound of the cabinet, the sound of the pistol taken down, then the nursery door and a key turning in its lock. Ottilie walked to the front door. She did not open it. She stood 2 feet back from it and waited. 3 knocks. Polite, unhurried. Miss Brixham. His voice through the door, pleasant, almost warm. The voice of a man who had spent 43 years being underestimated and found it useful. I know you are inside. The dowager's carriage is in the lane. I have ridden a long way, and I have no intention of making trouble. Open the door and let us speak like sensible people. Sir Denholm. She kept her voice even and carried it clearly through the old wood. The Duke is 4 miles from here and returning within the hour with a magistrate and constables. You have, at the most, 40 minutes to be gone from this lane. I suggest you use them. A pause. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. Not threatening yet, but testing. Miss Brixham, I am the children's cousin and their nearest male relation after their father. I have every right to satisfy myself as to their welfare. Open the door. You have no right that a Cumberland magistrate will recognize this morning, Ottilie said. The children are upstairs behind a locked door with their grandmother. She is armed. I am armed. If you force this door, you will not leave this cottage alive, because she will shoot you. And I will testify to every court in England that I watched her do it in defense of those children. And Cumberland will agree with us before your body is cold. Go. Silence. Then, and she had not expected this, a sound that resolved itself into a low, almost admiring laugh. Miss Brixham, he said, you have been, for 3 years, the most interesting woman in my cousin's house. I don't suppose you would consider. The sound of his boot on the door, not a kick. A test, a single deliberate pressure against the lower panel, feeling how the wood sat in its frame. She raised her voice by exactly 1 register, not shouting, carrying, so that it would travel clearly through the old cottage ceiling above her. Gwyneth, he is forcing the door. The interval that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then, from above, slow, deliberate, entirely audible through the plaster and old timber, the sound of a pistol being cocked. The pressure on the door stopped. Miss Brixham? Denholm said. And his voice had changed again, flatter now, calculating. You are bluffing. I am not bluffing. And I will tell you what else I am not doing. I am not uncertain about what we know. The Duke has spent 8 months building a case against you. Your debts to Mr. Starling, your letter of November to Mrs. Leverley, the preparation you placed in Hugo's coat after I refused to administer it to him directly. We have all of it. He offered you exile. You did not take exile. You came here instead. That was your mistake, Sir Denholm, and it is the last one you have available. Go now, or it will be decided for you. A long pause, long enough that she heard the morning birds starting in the hedgerow beyond the lane, long enough that the kettle she had abandoned began to whistle faintly in the kitchen behind her. Then, hoofbeats, fast, from the direction of the village. too fast for a man who had not seen the gray horse at the gate and understood immediately what it meant. Auriel's voice, outside, before his horse had fully stopped. "Denholm, step away from that door." A beat of silence. Then Denholm's voice, turning, recalibrating. "Cousin, I came only to satisfy myself that the children were well. Surely you cannot object to... Your letter to Mrs. Laverley was opened in London on Tuesday." Auriel's voice was not raised. It carried anyway, through the door and through the walls of the cottage, with the particular quality of a man who had spent 8 months being quiet and was now finished with it. "You were tracked from Carlisle yesterday morning. Mr. Holthwaite is behind me with the Cumberland magistrate and 4 constables. You have one choice to make, and you will make it in the next 30 seconds. You step into that carriage voluntarily, you accept transportation, and the poisoning charge stays sealed. It never sees a London paper. Your mother reads nothing, and the Calverston name is spared. Or you run, and by Sunday every paper in England carries what we have, and your mother lives her last years reading it over breakfast. 30 seconds. Ottilie stood inside the door with the knife in her hand and listened. Above her, not a sound from the nursery. 3 children holding themselves still, because they were Calverstons, and they had been told to stay behind a locked door, and they had. The dowager on the landing with the pistol, also still. The 30 seconds passed. "I will come," Denholm said, the voice of a man who had calculated to the end and found no better number. "Good." Auriel, flat and final. "Hands where I can see them. Walk." The sounds that followed were orderly. Holthwaite's voice arriving with the constables, boots on the lane's frozen ground, the creak of a carriage door, the sound of it closing, the carriage pulling away, the constables' horses moving off. Then quiet, the clean, absolute quiet of a lane in early morning, with no one left in it who should not be there. 3 minutes. She counted them. 1 knock at the door. Not 3, 1. "Ottilie." His voice, close to the wood, and the use of her Christian name, was not something she had time to account for. "It is done. Open the door." She set the knife on the hall table. She opened the door. He was on the threshold, breathing hard, his coat edged with frost from the ride, the pistol still in his right hand. They looked at each other across the 4 feet of the doorway in the gray morning light, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she stepped back and he came in. He put the pistol on the hall table beside her knife. He turned to her, and he took both her hands, the first time in 3 years, the first deliberate touch in 3 years, and held them, palms together, inside his own. "Thank you," he said. "You came in time." "I came in time because you bought me the time. If you had waited at Ravenholme for me to ask for your evidence, he would have been through that door before I had a warrant." From the top of the stairs, the dowager's voice, steady and white as the plaster wall behind her, and the pistol lowered to her side. "Auriel, the children want to come down. May they?" "Yes, Mother," he said. "Bring them down." Ottilie pulled her hands back. She picked up the knife from the hall table, not as threat, as purpose, because she had bread to cut and children to feed, and walked to the kitchen. Behind her, the sound of the nursery door unlocking. 3 pairs of feet on the stairs, and then Auriel dropping to his knees in the hall, and the sound of all 3 children reaching him at once. The return to Ravenholme was made in Auriel's carriage, with the children distributed among the seats and the dowager occupying the corner with the authority of a woman who had driven a carriage through the pre-dawn dark and held a pistol on a landing, and was now, appropriately, resting. Ottilie sat inside, not on the box, It was the first time in 6 years of her adult working life that she had ridden inside a carriage that was not a public coach, and she was aware of it, and she said nothing about it. And the Dowager noticed her not saying it, and also said nothing. 2 weeks after the return, Sir Denholm Calverston signed articles of voluntary transportation in the Cumberland magistrates' chambers. The poisoning charge was sealed at Oriel's petition, with Denholm's written consent to transportation as consideration. Mr. Starling accepted a reduced settlement from the Calverston estate in exchange for silence. Mrs. Leverley received an annuity and did not write again. Denholm sailed for New South Wales in March. The Calverston name was spared public scandal in London. Lady Isolde's promise was kept in its honourable half, the half that had always been worth keeping. 6 weeks after the return, in the nursery corridor at Ravenholme, Ottilie came out of Millicent's room to find Oriel in the corridor. He had been there each evening for 3 weeks. She had begun to expect him, and she had not told him she had begun to expect him, and he had continued to be there anyway. Tonight she turned and saw him and did not walk past. She crossed the 3 feet between them, placed both hands flat against his chest, not pushing, resting, looked up at him, and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been waiting long enough that waiting had become a kind of absurdity. And his arms came fully around her, one hand at the small of her back, the other in her hair. And when they parted, she kept her forehead against his for a moment. "I wondered when," he said. "I have been waiting 3 weeks for you to decide," she said. "I decided tonight." He kissed her again, his initiative this time slower, and she kissed him back with her hands moving up to his shoulders. And when they finally stepped apart, she walked down the corridor toward her own rooms without turning. She heard him exhale behind her. She did not turn. They married 3 weeks later in the parish church. With the children in the front pew, Philippa upright and attentive, Hugo watching his father with an expression that had been working its way towards something for weeks and arrived that morning. Millicent holding a small bunch of Ravenholme hothouse flowers that she had asked specifically to carry and had not let anyone else touch. Their wedding night at Ravenholme, Ottilie had lit the candles herself, the good ones from the upper shelf, and she had let down her hair and was standing by the window in her shift when Oriel came through from his dressing room and stopped inside the door. He looked at her, fully without apology. A man who had been given permission for the first time to look at his wife and was not going to pretend he did not want to. She turned from the window. "Come here, Oriel," she said. He crossed to her and took her face in both hands and kissed her slowly, and her hands went to the buttons of his waistcoat, and his mouth moved to her throat and the line of her jaw and the soft place below her ear. And she made a small sound that surprised her and did not surprise him. He lifted her and she let him, and he carried her the 3 steps to the bed and laid her down and followed. And the last thing described is her hands in his hair as he bent over her, and her voice saying his name once, clearly, as the candle on the bedside table went out. The Ravenholme nursery. An April evening. The windows were open for the first time since autumn, and the light was the long, level gold of early spring. Hugo and Philippa were already in their rooms, and Ottilie was sitting on the edge of Millicent's bed while Millicent, who was 6 and serious in the particular way of children who have decided to take the world at its word, looked at her with a question she had been composing for weeks. "Miss Brixham," Millicent said, "are you staying?" "I am staying, Millicent." "Forever?" Ottilie considered this with the gravity it deserved. "As long as you need me," she said, "and then longer because I will want to." Millicent was quiet for a moment, working through the logic of this. "May I call you something other than Miss Brixham now?" she said. "Yes. When we are alone, the five of us. You may call me what you wish. I should like to call you Ottilie. Then you may. Good night, Ottilie." "Good night, Millicent," Ottilie said softly. She blew out the candle. She stood at the door for a moment in the dark, listening to Millicent settle. And then she drew the door closed behind her. Auriel was in the corridor, waiting. He had been there when she came out of Hugo's room and when she came out of Philippa's room. And he was there now. Not formally, not with any particular expression of waiting, simply present, as he had been each evening since they returned from Cumberland and had not stopped being. He took her hand, fingers laced with hers, familiar. "What did she call you?" he said. "My name," Ottilie said. "Ah," he said quietly. They walked down the corridor together, toward the rooms that were theirs now. The house, quiet around them. 3 children sleeping behind 3 closed doors. The cousin on a ship 3 weeks out from Portsmouth. The name intact. The promise kept in the half that had been worth keeping all along. No single object carried the weight of what they had come through. No key, no letter, no vial on a wooden counter. Only a corridor and a married couple walking it together, and the simple, sufficient fact of their moving in the same direction.